перших днів війни ми на фронті. Робимо свою справу чесно та з душею.
It's been a week since Ukraine's surprise cross-border incursion into Russia, and Moscow still does not have the situation under control.
Осторожненько, осторожненько, давайте.
Вы из Ероги?
Да.
Tens of thousands of Russians have been forced to flee their homes as Ukrainian troops continue to encroach onto Russian territory. Kyiv's forces claim to control 1,000 square kilometers of Russian territory by now. The incursion is a major embarrassment for Russian President Vladimir Putin, who has vowed to kick the enemy out. But his troops are yet to stop the Ukrainian advance. Ukraine's President Zelensky said his forces were continuing to advance into Kursk and ordered his generals to develop the next key steps in the operation. Ukrainian forces entered Russia's Kursk region in the first week of August, taking over 24 settlements. It was the biggest attack by a foreign army on Russian soil since World War II. Around 1,000 Ukrainian troops advanced as far as 35 kilometers into the Kursk region. The incursion was a big change in Kyiv's tactics. The Ukrainian military has in the past regularly attacked targets inside Russia with drones and missiles. But until last week, it had not launched any official ground incursions across the border. Ukraine continued intense artillery and drone attacks along with the movement of mechanized troops into enemy territory. Russia's defense ministry said it foiled new Ukrainian attacks in Kursk by enemy mobile groups in armored vehicles to break through deep into Russian territory. The objective of the incursion is still anybody's guess. One theory is that Ukraine wants to conquer as much of Russian territory as possible and exert pressure on Moscow. This would strengthen Ukraine's position in possible peace negotiations with Russia. Ukrainian land occupied by Russia could be exchanged for Russian land conquered by Ukraine. For instance, Kyiv has been partly occupied by Ukraine since the war began in 2022. The advance onto Russian soil could also create a buffer zone for the population in the contested areas of Ukraine. It is also intended to weaken the Russian army and could force Russia to deploy more troops to the embattled border region. Russia lacks the manpower to compensate for losses on the front line despite its conscription measures. Ukraine said it would not hold on to Russian territory captured in the cross-border incursion and offered to stop the raids if Moscow agreed to just peace. Ever since Russia sparked the conflict in eastern Ukraine and annexed Crimea in 2014, the war Moscow has been raging on Ukraine had barely touched the Russian people. Now, by bringing the war to Russia, Ukraine has forced nearly 200,000 Russians to evacuate border regions. The governor of Russia's Belgorod region, on Ukraine's northern border, has declared a regional state of emergency, blaming relentless bombardment by Ukraine. Putin is not used to having his authority and his power challenged. This incursion is the second major humiliation for the Russian president in just over a year after the Wagner mutiny in June 2023. The incursion also sent a strong signal to Kyiv's allies that the Ukrainian military could seize the initiative and rout the Russian army. US President Joe Biden said Ukraine had created a real dilemma for Putin.
What do you have to say about what's happening in Russia and Ukraine? Have you spoken with anyone in the Ukrainian government?
I've spoken with my staff on a regular basis, probably every 4 or 5 hours for the last 6 or 8 days. And it's creating a real dilemma for Putin. And we've been in direct contact, constant contact with the Ukrainians. That's all I'm going to say about it while it's active. Okay?
Can Ukraine translate short-term gains into a lasting strategic advantage? The success of Ukraine's incursion largely came down to the element of surprise. But once Russian reinforcements are in place, it is unlikely that Ukraine will be able to hold on to the territory it has managed to seize. Russia has already relocated some of its troops that were stationed in occupied southern Ukraine to the Kursk region. To try and counter Ukrainian gains, Russian troops have continued their offensive on Pokrovsk and elsewhere in Ukraine's Donetsk region. Ukraine has taken a big risk by advancing on Russian territory and could end up losing more troops. How long the country can sustain the operation will ultimately depend on the West and its military support. But Ukraine has spent the past few months trying to hold off further Russian advances. So the surprise incursion could give its troops a much-needed boost, especially as the war with Russia drags on with no end in sight.